contemporary repertoire. He has given over 100 first performances, including the U.S. premieres of several works by leading European composers. He has performed with symphony orchestras throughout North and South America, Mexico, and Europe. He is the guitarist and conductor for the ensemble N-O-I-S-E. Now that's noise, but I'll bet it's a beautiful noise. And he's co-founder of the Sound On, not Sound Off, Festival of Modern Music held in La Jolla, California. Colin earned his Doctor of Musical Arts at the University of California in San Diego. He currently serves as director of the music program at UCCS. He's a lecturer in humanities. He's member of the advisory board for the Center for Religious Diversity and Public Life at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and the Chamber Orchestra is truly honored that he's going to spend this weekend with you. You're going to have a lot of fun with Colin. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's funny, you know, I played lots and lots of concerts, and I always think it's a bit nerve-wracking to be standing backstage and someone is in front saying all these great things about you. Because then if you come out on stage, they're expecting that you're going to do great things. It might be nicer almost if they gave the introduction afterwards. So you can say like, well, yeah, he was all right. Anyway, thank you for coming out today. It's going to be a great concert. I was at the concert last night, and I think you're going to love the selection of music, especially because we have so many soloists for this concert. This is really a concert of soloists. In every piece, soloists are featured. And so I thought, you're probably all expecting me to start talking about Bach Brandenburg 5 right away, but I'm not. I decided I'm going to start from the end. The last piece on the program today is the Ginastera concert variations. And how many of you in here have heard the music of Ginastera before? Okay. Of course my friend Sharon Skidrell, she's heard all music, so I would expect that. What about Astor Piazzolla? How many Piazzolla? Okay. Well, interestingly enough, Ginastera was Piazzolla's teacher. And Piazzolla has come to be, I would say, the most played composer from Argentina of the 20th century. But Ginastera, very highly regarded. And in the realm of concert music, I think Ginastera is maybe even put on a pedestal more than Piazzolla was. So it's great to talk about Ginastera, and it's great for a guitarist to come talk about Ginastera because of all of his output. He wrote only one piece for guitar, a guitar sonata from the mid-1970s. But do you know what the sound, the predominant underlying chordal sound for most of his music, all the way from his Opus 2, which is the Danzas Argentinas from 1937, up toward the end of his life, over a 40-year span, it's this chord. The open strings of the guitar. And in fact, we're going to come back to this. I'm going to show you. This is the opening sound that the harp plays in the piece today. And this is true of Ginastera's guitar sonata as well, from the mid-70s. It starts off with these great chords that sound like this. That's the opening of the guitar sonata. And I actually have a really funny story about that if you want to hear it. Do you want to hear a funny story? Sure. You've got to sit through 2 hours of serious music. You might as well have a funny story to get yourself going, right? So, I was playing at this guitar festival in Tijuana, in Mexico. This is probably about 10 years ago. And they had billed this particular concert evening as like Tres Nacionalidades or algo así. It was an American guitarist, me. It was a guitarist from Mexico, and then there was a guitarist from South America. He might have been from Uruguay or Paraguay, I don't remember exactly. But we were supposed to share this program. So it was going to be a pretty long concert because each of us was supposed to play about 30 to 35 minute set. And concerts start later in Mexico anyway. right? They would never fly in the springs. The concerts start at maybe 8:30 or 9 o'clock, right? Okay, so we're all downstairs, and it's really chaotic, and there's all these people, and so we're all getting ready, and they decided, okay, the fellow from South America is going to play first. So he goes upstairs. It's a huge auditorium. It seats about 1,500 people. We hear him go upstairs, and the audience applauds, and then we hear him start to play. You can very faintly hear it. And so then about 30 minutes later, the audience applauds, and he comes back downstairs. And then the other guy's getting ready to go out, my colleague from Mexico. And then a film crew comes in to the green room to do an interview with us all. Like this is at the intermission, right? So it's like halftime or something on Sports Center. So we do this interview, and then the second guy goes up. And he's going to play the Ginastera Sonata. And so I'm down in the green room, just warming up a little bit. I hear him go upstairs. I hear the audience applaud. And then I hear that big first chord. All right? And so I was like, oh, he's doing great. Okay, so I'm going back to my theme. And about 3 minutes later, I hear this furious commotion of this guy coming down the stairs. He's like, ay, Dios mío, ay, por favor, ¿qué pasó? And I'm like, and it's this guitarist, and he's coming down the stairs, and his face is red, his eyes are bulging. I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened? It turned out that he played those big first chords of the Ginastera, and someone in the audience had a seizure. And so they had to stop the concert, and they had to bring the ambulance in, and they came in and they took this poor guy out of there. And then, so we were downstairs, and so finally, maybe an hour later, they decided to resume the concert. So he decided not to play the Ginastera after all, because he was a little worried about it. So he played some other music, and then I think finally around 11:30 at night, I went up and played. And by that time, the audience was either really tired or drunk or both. So it was a very interesting concert experience. But I was so glad that I wasn't the one that decided to play the Ginastera that night, because as a performer, you don't want to say that you put someone into an epileptic seizure. Right? I mean, maybe a fit of ecstasy or something, not a seizure. So anyway, that's a funny story about the Ginastera. And the whole piece, the Ginastera Sonata for guitar, ends also with open strings and with this irregular rhythm accented. It's this isn't going to be exactly it, but it's something like. Very aggressive like that, and it almost has a Stravinskian aspect of irregular rhythms. If you've ever heard the Rite of Spring, okay, so you're going to hear a little bit of Stravinsky's aspect in this Ginastera piece, along with some rhythms that come from South America, like the malambo and other of these gaucho dances. So you'll hear a little bit of that in the piece, but you'll really hear this sonority throughout. So let me see if, I don't know if we ever got the internet working here, but let me see if this is going to work. I want to play just the opening of this piece. So first of all, it's a concert variation. So you're all familiar with theme and variations, right? So we're used to theme and variations, maybe like this from the classical here, right? Handel's Harmonious Blacksmith, right? This is a theme and variations by an Italian guitarist. And then the variations come in. And then there's one that goes. There's even a minor one. Right? So we know about theme and variations. Okay. We're going to hear, there's 11 different variations in this Ginastera piece. The first one is just harp and cello. Very beautiful. Let me see if this will sound. About the guitar. So I'll pretend I got hired to play the harp part. that, Nasheed. I could be a harp player for the orchestra.
Yes, at lower cost.
And in fact, if I just kind of strum the guitar a little bit in the background here, you'll hear that almost this whole first variation is based on this. Even the cello melody, lots of little strings of the guitar reflected in that melody. And now the orchestra. Beautiful, right? To hear, it's really neat to see, I think, a big orchestra on stage and only 2 players are playing. You know, Mahler was great at that, right? There's parts in Mahler symphonies where you're playing in this huge orchestra, and then all of a sudden it's just you. In Mahler 7, there's this little guitar mandolin duet, and it's really bizarre to be playing and there's 100 people sort of sitting there waiting for you, right? But the Hinastera is really going to be like that. You'll hear that this cello and harp duo comes back toward the end, and then this is interspersed by lots of lively orchestral playing, very rhythmic, a little bit like the last movement of the guitar sonata that I played for you there. And you'll hear all of the principal instruments feature. So it's almost like a concerto for orchestra in that sense, that you have all these different players feature. So that's the last piece on the program, and it's really fun. Now before that, there's a bunch of Baroque music, right? We've got Vivaldi, we've got Gimignani, and of course the Bach-Brandenburg Concerto, which is what a lot of people here signed up to see, right? Has a great harpsichord solo, a huge shredding harpsichord solo at the end that Eric is just going to kill. He did a great job last night. And so maybe we should talk just a little bit about some of the general tenets of Baroque music. So Baroque music in the period is, I don't know, maybe from around 1600 to 1750 or so. From the time of Shakespeare until the death of Bach. And prior to that, we're coming out of this polyphonic period of the late Renaissance. Music had been very polyphonic, lots of sober, counter-Reformation Catholic Church music. Palestrina is a great example of late Renaissance polyphonic music. And then musicians around the turn of the 17th century became increasingly interested in having more emotional content expressed through music. And there was another quite popular form of music that developed in the early Baroque. Does anybody know which one that one was? It starts with an O, and people sing, and a lot of times people die during these things. You know which one that is? Opera, right? Well, they don't really die, but in the plots they die a lot, right? So opera, Monteverdi's early operas from the first decade of the 17th century, you'll notice in those that there's a definite emphasis on the text being very clearly heard. So in Orfeo, right? Orpheus sings this thing, and it's mostly just a drone happening underneath, and then the instruments chime in. And then Orpheus is left to sing, and then the instruments come back in. So these folks were very interested in the text being very clearly heard, because they felt that if the audience can't understand the text because it's set in this really crazy polyphonic setting, that they're not going to receive the same emotional impact. So we fast forward to the late Baroque period, which we're talking about here with Bach. There's still, even though the music we're listening to today is instrumental, there's still this preoccupation with emotional delivery, emotional reception through music. And it goes back to this idea of the doctrine of the affections. And this is something that came from a reading of René Descartes, Passions of the Soul, great philosopher Descartes, who in 1640s writes this thing called the Passions of the Soul, where he's trying to rationalize affections, or maybe emotions, we might call them, and understand how they are part of physiologically what happens in the body. So they thought that the reason that we experience joy or a sense of wonder or sadness is because there's something physiologically that happens within us. I actually brought here, I'm going to read you something from this doctrine of the affections. So again, this is from Descartes, and he says, "Let us allow that the soul has its chief seat in a small gland which is in midbrain, and that from there it radiates through all the rest of the body, owing to the intervention of the animal spirits, the nerves, and even the blood." He goes on to say that, for instance, in joy, he's saying, in joy it is not so much the nerves of the spleen, the liver or the stomach, or the intestines which are active, as those which are in the whole of the rest of the body, and particularly that which is round the orifices of the heart, which opening and enlarging these orifices supplies the means whereby the blood, which the other nerves drive from the veins to the heart, may enter there and issue forth in a larger quantity than usual. So Baroque musicians later, and theorists, took this and said, well, we're interested in arousing different emotions in people. And if this can be done by causing some physiological change within their body, maybe we can write music that somehow activates those physiological changes, right? Maybe I could write a piece that based on the sounds or the rhythms or the contrast, will activate these passions within people and will cause them to have a sense of wanting to throw money on the stage. No, have a sense of wonder, or a sense of joy. And so this preoccupation with emotion and drama is very much present in the idea of the concerto, because Baroque musicians being interested in contrast, in drama, high versus low sounds, fast passages versus slow passages, loud versus soft, extremely dense texture versus extremely sparse texture. And what's a great way to do that? With a concerto, right? A concerto is a solo instrument, or in the case of the Concerto Grosso, a group of instruments, versus the orchestra, right? It's great. It's David and Goliath. It's this contest that's going to happen. And so you can write things for the solo instrument to play, and then the orchestra responds, back and forth, and that kind of thing. They can be antagonistic toward each other, or they can let each other have their own space. So you're going to hear the first piece on the program today is a concerto by Vivaldi for two celli, which is an unusual concerto combination. You're going to really enjoy that. That features Pam Chadden and Gerald Miller. And Vivaldi was the Baroque composer under whom the concerto reaches its mature form. He wasn't the first one to write a concerto, but he wrote many, many of them. And so over the tenure of his compositional career, the concerto was well established. Now in the Bach Brandenburg 5, this is an example of what's called a concerto grosso, because there's more than one solo instrument. I already gave one of them away, the harpsichord. What are the other two solo instruments in Brandenburg 5? Does anybody know? Oh, Sharon, you can't answer though. Well, okay, if no one else knows, Sharon.
Flute and violin.
Flute and violin, yes, very. Very correct. So the harpsichord, the flute, and the violin are the three soloists, and this is backed by an orchestra of strings. Okay, and so what happens? It's structured in something called ritornello form, and the ritornello was something in the Baroque period that would refer to, could be either an instrumental interlude during an opera. Somebody sings, they're featured, and then there's this instrumental interlude. Or in the case of the Bach-Brandenburg, it's this melodic passage that comes back. It recurs over and over again. And what it does is it serves to kind of tie the whole thing together. So we have a complete statement of the ritornello at the beginning. I'll play it for you. I bet you're going to recognize this. Another thing that's funny about listening to harpsichord on recording is that it sounds really loud, but in real life the harpsichord's right? So don't think the harpsichord is going to be quite this loud. That's the first complete statement of this ritornello, this theme. That will recur in its entirety again at the end. The first movement, and this is the first movement we're talking about, it's about 9 to 10 minutes long. But at several different parts within there, partial restatements of this ritornello happen, and it just kind of serves to balance what the soloists are doing. So in between the ritornello passages, where the whole orchestra is playing, that's called the ripieno, by the way. The concertino is the little group of instruments. The ripieno is the full orchestra. And so you'll hear that at different times, partial statements of the ripieno, the whole orchestra, come back. And in between, what do the soloists do? Well, the harpsichord, he's playing all the time. He should get paid more. Where's Nashi? Right? Because the harpsichord, he's not only a soloist, but he has to play the continuo part in the background. Continuo is just the harmony that's happening. In the Baroque period, another thing that happens, along with all this interest in contrast and emotion, is that music becomes more stratified than in the Renaissance period. So instead of having lots of polyphonic lines moving together in a texture, we have more often a predominant melody, a predominant bass line, which is also more vigorous and active in the Baroque period. And that helps to really solidify this emerging thing we call tonality now. And then in the middle, there's the continuo part, which is the harmony part. And so lots of instruments could provide a continuo. You got to have a bass instrument of some kind. It could be a cello, could be a string bass, could be a gamba. And then you could have the harpsichord, the lute. Sadly, the guitar wasn't around then, but they had lutes. They also had the organ, right? The organ and the harpsichord were the two predominant keyboard instruments of this period. And so the harpsichord, he has to do everything. He's playing the continuo part during the orchestra, but then he becomes featured, especially as the movement goes on. So let me play just a little bit more. We heard that introduction. Now we'll hear the first entrance of our soloists acting in that capacity. That was only maybe 1/4 of the length of that opening ritornello that we heard. So it never comes back in its entirety, but parts of it come back, first phrase, the second phrase, or the first half or the second half, before we get to the end. And the soloists become more and more active as the movement goes along. And what are they doing? Well, they're imitating each other a lot. right? We know that during the Baroque period, the fugue was a type of writing that, of course, Bach was the great master of. And that's basically a very complicated version of something like Row, Row Your Boat, right? If we were all to start singing in here today, I won't put you on the spot, but if we were to do that, that would be like a very, very simplistic version of an imitative polyphonic, right? So we hear the instruments imitate. The violin does something, the flute does something. They take a theme that the orchestra plays and they pass it back and forth. And all the while, the harpsichord is dutifully chugging along in the background, playing chords and sometimes all these scales. And then as the movement goes on, the harpsichord starts to become more and more predominant until finally he has this really amazing cadenza. So the cadenza was a part of the first movement of lots and lots of Baroque concerti. And that was a chance for the soloist to show off, basically, to show what he or she had. Sometimes they were improvised. Nowadays, they're not improvised so much. Most modern classical musicians probably wouldn't feel comfortable improvising a cadenza. And that brings us to this aspect of virtuosity. And that's also something that develops at the start of the Baroque period. Because you think to the Renaissance, who were the great patrons of music during the Renaissance? It was the church, right? So, and then in the Baroque period, we have still the church, but lots of other, basically, aristocrats, right? In fact, Bach may have written this Brandenburg Concerto when he was under the employment of a prince. So, virtuosity now finally, well, maybe when you're supposed to be performing music that's glorifying God, it's not such a great idea to draw a bunch of your attention to yourself, right? By shredding away on the harpsichord or the organ during the Mass, right? But during the Baroque period, this becomes something increasingly interesting. And this idea of virtuosity is something that we really take for granted now. That when we go to see someone perform, usually we expect to see them do something that we might never be able to do, right? Oh man, that guy's awesome because he plays this way better than most people, right? So that's exciting. It's exciting to see this virtuosic aspect. And I'm not going to play it for you now, this cadenza, because I don't want to steal the thunder from Eric. But it's a really, really great cadenza, and it's long, and by the time it finally ends and the orchestra comes in with this last ritornello, it's really just fantastic. You almost feel like the first movement of this is the big one, right? The second and third movements are almost anticlimactic, I think, in that regard. So yeah, that's a little bit about Bach, and I think, well, it's about 2:15 now, so I think it might be a good idea to just see if anyone has any questions, because I really haven't taken time to entertain any of those. I just kind of blasted through here, but I'm certainly happy to.
You know what, Colin, I thought, because you had a perfect lead in it, what Thomas is doing in this concert is he's sharing with you the musicianship of his players in the chamber orchestra, because we're very proud of them. And he has gotten them to this level because this is his 20th anniversary. So I wanted you to understand that, and you will be very much amazed and pleased at what they do. So my comments to you are, you'll be able to hear all of them very clearly, no matter where your seat is. I know you all have reserved seats because they're very special patrons. Do you have any questions for Colin before I make the final request?
We didn't get too much time to talk about the others, but I don't know. I think that the two pieces that I've discussed, I think these are the big ones for the concert. And yeah, well, if you have any questions
isn't he
afterwards,
wonderful?
I'll be happy.